thevoicebeforethevoid.net. Sticks by Carl Edward Wagner.
It's kind of fun. I mean, it's not really great, but it's fun. Sticks. 1. A lashed-together framework of sticks jutted from a small cairn along the stream. Colin Leverett studied it in perplexment. Half a dozen odd lengths of branch, wired together at cross angles for no fathomable purpose. It reminded him unpleasantly of some bizarre crucifix, and he wondered what might lie beneath the cairn. It was the spring of 1942, the kind of day to make the war seem distant and unreal, although the draft notice waited on his desk. In a few days, Leverett would lock his rural studio, wonder if he would see it again, be able to use its pens and brushes and carving tools when he did return. It was goodbye to the woods and streams of upstate New York, too. No fly rods, no tramps through the countryside in Hitler's Europe. No point in putting off fishing that trout stream he had driven past once, exploring back roads of the Otselic Valley. Man Brook, so it was marked on the old Geological Survey map, ran southeast of De Ruyter. The unfrequented country road crossed over a stone bridge, old before the first horseless carriage, but Leverett's Ford eased across and onto the shoulder. Taking fly rod and tackle, he included pocket flask and tied an iron skillet to his belt. He'd work his way downstream a few miles. By afternoon he'd lunch on fresh trout, maybe some bullfrog legs. It was a fine, clear stream, though difficult to fish, as dense bushes hung out from the bank, broken with stretches of open water, hard to work without being seen. But the trout rose boldly to his fly, and Leverett was in fine spirits. From the bridge, the valley along Man Brook began as fairly open pasture, but half a mile downstream the land had fallen into disuse, and was thick with second-growth evergreens and scrub apple trees. Another mile, and the scrub merged with dense forest, which continued unbroken. The land here, he had learned, had been taken over by the state many years back. As Leverett followed the stream, he noted the remains of an old railroad embankment. No vestige of tracks or ties, only the embankment itself, overgrown with large trees. The artist rejoiced in the beautiful dry-wall culverts spanning the stream as it wound through the valley. To his mind it seemed eerie, this forgotten railroad running straight and true through virtual wilderness. He could imagine an old wood-burner with its conical stack, steaming along through the valley, dragging 2 or 3 wooden coaches. It must be a branch of the old Oswego Midland Railroad, he decided, abandoned rather suddenly in the 1870s. Leverett, who had a memory for detail, knew of it from a story his grandfather told of riding the line in 1871 from Otselic to De Ruyter on his honeymoon. The engine had so labored up the steep grade over Crude Hill that he got off to walk alongside. Probably that steep grade was the reason for the line's abandonment. When he came across a scrap of board nailed to several sticks set into a stone wall, his darkest thought was that it might read, "No trespassing." Curiously, though the board was weathered featureless, the nails seemed quite new. Leverett scarcely gave it much thought, until a short distance beyond he came upon another such contrivance. And another. Now he scratched at the day's stubble on his long jaw. This didn't make sense. A prank? But on whom? A child's game? No, the arrangement was far too sophisticated. As an artist, Leverett appreciated the craftsmanship of the work, the calculated angles and lengths, the designed intricacy of the maddeningly inexplicable devices. There was something distinctly uncomfortable about their effect. Leverett reminded himself that he had come here to fish and continued downstream. But as he worked around a thicket, he again stopped in puzzlement. Here was a small open space with more of the stick lattices, and an arrangement of flat stones laid out on the ground. The stones, likely taken from one of the many dry-wall culverts, made a pattern maybe 20 by 15 feet, that at first glance resembled a ground plan for a house. Intrigued, Leverett quickly saw that this was not so. If the ground plan for anything, it would have to be for a small maze. The bizarre lattice structures were all around. Sticks from trees and bits of board nailed together in fantastic array. They defied description. No two seemed alike. Some were only 1 or 2 sticks lashed together in parallel or at angles. Others were worked into complicated lattices of dozens of sticks and boards. One could have been a child's treehouse. It was built in 3 planes, but was so abstract and useless that it could be nothing more than an insane conglomeration of sticks and wires. Sometimes the contrivances were stuck in a pile of stones or a wall, maybe thrust into the railroad embankment or nailed to a tree. It should have been ridiculous. It wasn't. Instead, it seemed somehow sinister. These utterly inexplicable, meticulously constructed lattices, spread through a wilderness where only a tree-grown embankment or a forgotten stone wall gave evidence that man had ever passed through. Leverett forgot about trout and frog legs, instead dug into his pockets for a notebook and stub of pencil. Busily he began to sketch the more intricate structures. Perhaps someone could explain them. Perhaps there was something to their insane complexity that warranted closer study for his own work. Leverett was roughly 2 miles from the bridge when he came upon the ruins of a house. It was an unlovely colonial farmhouse, box-shaped and gambrel-roofed, fast falling into the ground. Windows were dark and empty. The chimneys on either end looked ready to topple. Rafters showed through open spaces in the roof, and the weathered boards of the walls had in places rotted away to reveal hewn timber beams. The foundation was stone and disproportionately massive. From the size of the unmortared stone blocks, its builder had intended the foundation to stand forever. The house was nearly swallowed up by undergrowth and rampant lilac bushes, but Leverett could distinguish what had been a lawn with imposing shade trees. Farther back were gnarled and sickly apple trees, and an overgrown garden where a few lost flowers still bloomed, wan and serpentine from years in the wild. These stick lattices were everywhere. The lawn, the trees, even the house, were covered with the uncanny structures. They reminded Leverett of 100 misshapen spider webs, grouped so closely together as to almost ensnare the entire house and clearing. Wondering, he sketched page on page of them as he cautiously approached the abandoned house. He wasn't certain just what he expected to find inside. The aspect of the farmhouse was frankly menacing, standing as it did in gloomy desolation where the forest had devoured the works of man, where the only sign that man had been here in this century were these insanely wrought lattice works of sticks and board. Some might have turned back at this point. Leverett, whose fascination for the macabre was evident in his art, instead was intrigued. He drew a rough sketch of the farmhouse and the grounds, overrun with the enigmatic devices, with thickets of hedges and distorted flowers. He regretted that it might be years before he could capture the eeriness of this place on scratchboard or canvas. The door was off its hinges, and Leverett gingerly stepped within, hoping that the flooring remained sound enough to bear even his sparse frame. The afternoon sun pierced the empty windows, mottling the decaying floorboards with great blotches of light. Dust drifted in the sunlight. The house was empty, stripped of furnishings other than indistinct tangles of rubble, mounded over with decay and the drifted leaves of many seasons. Someone had been here, and recently. Someone who had literally covered the mildewed walls with diagrams of the mysterious lattice structures. The drawings were applied directly to the walls, crisscrossing the rotting wallpaper and crumbling plaster in bold black lines. Some of the vertiginous complexity covered an entire wall like a mad mural. Others were small, only a few crossed lines, and reminded Leverett of cuneiform glyphics. His pencil hurried over the pages of his notebook. Leverett noted with fascination that a number of the drawings were recognizable as schematics of lattices he had earlier sketched. Was this then the planning room for the madman or educated idiot who had built these structures? The gouges etched by the charcoal into the soft plaster appeared fresh, done days or months ago, perhaps. A darkened doorway opened into the cellar. Were there drawings there as well? And what else? Leverett wondered if he should dare it. Except for streamers of light that crept through cracks in the flooring, the cellar was in darkness, "Hello," he called. "Anyone here?" It didn't seem silly just then. These stick lattices hardly seemed the work of a rational mind. Leverett wasn't enthusiastic with the prospect of encountering such a person in this dark cellar. It occurred to him that virtually anything might transpire here, and no one in the world of 1942 would ever know. And that in itself was too great a fascination for one of Leverett's temperament. Carefully he started down the cellar stairs. They were stone, and thus solid, but treacherous with moss and debris. The cellar was enormous, even more so in the darkness. Leverett reached the foot of the steps and paused for his eyes to adjust to the damp gloom. An earlier impression recurred to him. The cellar was too big for the house. Had another dwelling stood here originally, perhaps destroyed and rebuilt by one of lesser fortune? Examine the stonework. Here were great blocks of gneiss that might support a castle. On closer look they reminded him of a fortress, for the drywall technique was startlingly Mycenaean. Like the house above, the cellar appeared to be empty, although without light Leverett could not be certain what the shadows hid. There seemed to be darker areas of shadow along sections of the foundation wall, suggesting openings to chambers beyond. Leverett began to feel uneasy, in spite of himself. There was something here, a large table-like bulk in the center of the cellar. Where a few ghosts of sunlight drifted down to touch its edges, it seemed to be of stone. Cautiously he crossed the stone paving to where it loomed, waist-high, maybe 8 feet long and less wide. A roughly shaped slab of gneiss, he judged, and supported by pillars of unmortared stone. In the darkness he could only get a vague conception of the object. He ran his hands along the slab. It seemed to have a groove along its edge. His groping fingers encountered fabric, something cold and leathery and yielding. Mildewed harness, he guessed in distaste. Something closed on his wrist, set icy nails into his flesh. Leverett screamed and lunged away with frantic strength. He was held fast, but the object on the stone slab pulled upward. A sickly beam of sunlight came down to touch one end of the slab. It was enough. As Leverett struggled backward and the thing that held him heaved up from the stone table, its face passed through the beam of light. It was a lich's face, desiccated flesh tight over its skull. Filthy strands of hair were matted over its scalp. Tattered lips were drawn away from broken yellowed teeth, and, sunken in their sockets, eyes that should be dead were bright with hideous life. Leverett screamed again, desperate with fear. His free hand clawed the iron skillet tied to his belt. Ripping it loose, he smashed at the nightmarish face with all his strength. For one frozen instant of horror, the sunlight let him see the skillet crush through the mold-eaten forehead like an axe, cleaving the dry flesh and brittle bone. The grip on his wrist failed. The cadaverous face fell away, and the sight of its caved-in forehead and unblinking eyes, from between which thick blood had begun to ooze, would awaken Leverett from nightmare on countless nights. But now Leverett tore free and fled. And when his aching legs faltered as he plunged headlong through the scrub growth, he was spurred to desperate energy by the memory of the footsteps that had stumbled up the cellar stairs behind him. 2.
It had a moldy head, but it still bled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When Colin Leverett returned from the war, his friends marked him a changed man. He had aged. There were streaks of gray in his hair. His springy step had slowed. The athletic leanness of his body had withered to an unhealthy gauntness. There were indelible lines to his face, and his eyes were haunted. More disturbing was an alteration of temperament. A mordant cynicism had eroded his earlier air of whimsical asceticism. His fascination with the macabre had assumed a darker mood, a morbid obsession that his old acquaintances found disquieting. But it had been that kind of a war. especially for those who had fought through the Apennines. Leverett might have told them otherwise, had he cared to discuss his nightmarish experience on Man Brook. But Leverett kept his own counsel, and when he grimly recalled that creature he had struggled with in the abandoned cellar, he usually convinced himself it had only been a derelict, a crazy hermit whose appearance had been distorted by the poor light and his own imagination. Nor had his blow more than glanced off the man's forehead, he reasoned, since the other had recovered quickly enough to give chase.
Wait a minute.
Yes?
It was a man?
Yeah.
I thought it was an animal of some kind.
A lich.
What's that?
A lich is a type of vampire and a type of a zombie. It's like an undead monster.
Okay, that changes things.
Yeah. I mean, the first part of the story, we already got a monster. No bullshitting around here.
Okay.
It was best not to dwell upon such matters, and this rational explanation helped restore sanity when he awoke from nightmares of that face. Thus Colin Leverett returned to his studio, and once more plied his pens and brushes and carving knives. The pulp magazines, where fans had acclaimed his work before the war, welcomed him back with long lists of assignments. There were commissions from galleries and collectors, unfinished sculptures and wooden models. Leverett busied himself. There were problems now. Short Stories returned a cover painting as too grotesque. The publishers of a new anthology of horror stories sent back a pair of his interior drawings. Too gruesome, especially the rotted, bloated faces of those hanged men. A customer returned a silver figurine, complaining that the martyred saint was too thoroughly martyred. Even Weird Tales, after heralding his return to its ghoul-haunted pages, began returning illustrations they considered too strong, even for our readers. Leverett tried half-heartedly to tone things down, found the results vapid and uninspired. Eventually the assignments stopped trickling in. Leverett, becoming more the recluse as years went by, dismissed the pulp days from his mind. Working quietly in his isolated studio, he found a living doing occasional commissioned pieces and gallery work, from time to time selling a painting or sculpture to major museums. Critics had much praise for his bizarre, abstract sculptures. 3. The war was 25 years' history when Colin Leverett received a letter from a good friend of the pulp days, Prescott Brandon, now editor-publisher of Gothic House, a small press that specialized in books of the weird fantasy genre. Despite a lapse in correspondence of many years, Brandon's letter began in his typically direct style. The Erie, /Salem, Massachusetts, /August 2nd. To the Macabre Hermit of the Midlands. Colin, I'm putting together a deluxe 3-volume collection of H. Kenneth Allard's horror stories. I well recall that Kent's stories were personal favorites of yours. How about shambling forth from retirement and illustrating these for me? We'll need 2 color jackets and a dozen line interiors each. Would hope that you can startle fandom with some especially ghastly drawings for these, something different from the hackneyed skulls and bats and werewolves carting off half-dressed ladies. Interested? I'll send you the materials and details, and you can have a free hand. Let us hear. Scotty. Leverett was delighted. He felt some nostalgia for the pulp days, and he had always admired Allard's genius in transforming visions of cosmic horror into convincing prose. He wrote Brandon an enthusiastic reply. He spent hours rereading these stories for inclusion, making notes and preliminary sketches. No squeamish sub-editors to offend here. Scotty meant what he said. Leverett bent to his task with maniacal relish. Something different, Scotty had asked. A free hand. Leverett studied his pencil sketches critically. The figures seemed headed in the right direction, but the drawings needed something more, something that would inject the mood of sinister evil that pervaded Allard's work. Grinning skulls and leathery bats. Trite. Allard demanded more. The idea had inexorably taken hold of him. Perhaps because Allard's tales evoked the same sense of horror, perhaps because Allard's visions of crumbling Yankee farmhouses and their depraved secrets so reminded him of that spring afternoon at Man Brook. Although he had refused to look at it since the day he had staggered in, half dead from terror and exhaustion, Leverett perfectly recalled where he had flung his notebook. He retrieved it from the back of a seldom-used file, thumbed through the wrinkled pages thoughtfully. These hasty sketches reawakened the sense of foreboding evil, the charnel horror of that day. Studying the bizarre lattice patterns, it seemed impossible to Leverett that others would not share his feeling of horror that the stick structures evoked in him. He began to sketch bits of stick latticework into his pencil roughs. The sneering faces of Allard's degenerate creatures took on an added shadow of menace. Leverett nodded, pleased with the effect. 4. Some months afterward, a letter from Brandon informed Leverett he had received the last of the Allard drawings, and was enormously pleased with the work. Brandon added a postscript. "For God's sake, Colin, what is it with these insane sticks you've got poking up everywhere in the Elos? The damn things get really creepy after a while. How on earth did you get onto this?" Leverett supposed he owed Brandon some explanation. Dutifully, he wrote a lengthy letter, setting down the circumstances of his experience at Man Brook, omitting only the horror that had seized his wrist in the cellar. Let Brandon think him eccentric, but not madman and murderer. Brandon's reply was immediate. "Colin, your account of the Man Brook episode is fascinating and incredible. It reads like the start of one of Allard's stories. I have taken the liberty of forwarding your letter to Alexander Steffroy in Pelham. Dr. Steffroy is an earnest scholar of this region's history, as you may already know. I am certain your account will interest him, and he may have some light to shed on the uncanny affair. Expect first volume, Voices from the Shadow, to be ready from the binder next month. The proofs looked great. Best, Scotty." The following week brought a letter postmarked Pelham, Massachusetts. "A mutual friend, Prescott Brandon, forwarded your fascinating account of discovering curious sticks and stone artifacts on an abandoned farm in upstate New York. I found this most intriguing and wonder if you recall further details. Can you relocate the exact site after 30 years? If possible, I'd like to examine the foundations this spring, as they call to mind similar megalithic sites of this region. Several of us are interested in locating what we believe are remains of megalithic construction dating back to the Bronze Age, and to determine their possible use in rituals of black magic in colonial days. Present archaeological evidence indicates that circa 1700 to 2000 BC, there was an influx of Bronze Age peoples into the northeast from Europe. We know that the Bronze Age saw the rise of an extremely advanced culture, and that as seafarers they were to have no peers until the Vikings. Remains of a megalithic culture originating in the Mediterranean can be seen in the Lion Gate in Mycenae, in the Stonehenge, and in dolmens, passage graves, and barrow mounds throughout Europe. Moreover, this seems to have represented far more than a style of architecture peculiar to the era. Rather, it appears to have been a religious cult whose adherents worshipped a sort of Earth Mother, served her with fertility rituals and sacrifices, and believed that immortality of the soul could be secured through interment in megalithic tombs. That this culture came to America cannot be doubted from the hundreds of megalithic remnants found, and now recognized, in our region. The most important site to date is Mystery Hill in New Hampshire, comprising a great many walls and dolmens of megalithic construction, most notably the Y Cavern Barrow Mound and the Sacrificial Table. See postcard. Less spectacular megalithic sites include the group of cairns and carved stones at Mineral Mount, subterranean chambers with stone passageways such as Petersham and Shutesbury, and unaccounted shaped megaliths and buried monks' cells throughout this region. Of further interest, these sites seem to have retained their mystic aura for the early colonials, and numerous megalithic sites show evidence of having been used for sinister purposes by colonial sorcerers and alchemists. This became particularly true after the witchcraft persecutions drove many practitioners into the western wilderness, explaining why upstate New York and western Massachusetts have seen the emergence of so many cultist groups in later years. Of particular interest here is Shadrach Ireland's Brethren of the New Light, who believed that the world was soon to be destroyed by sinister powers from outside, and that they, the elect, would then attain physical immortality. The elect who died beforehand were to have their bodies preserved on tables of stone until the old ones came forth to return them to life. We have definitely linked the megalithic sites at Shutesbury to later unwholesome practices of the New Light cult. They were absorbed in 1781 by Mother Ann Lee's Shakers, and Ireland's putrescent corpse was hauled from the stone table in his cellar and buried. Thus, I think it probable that your farmhouse may have figured in similar hidden practices. At Mystery Hill, a farmhouse was built in 1826 that incorporated one dolmen in its foundations. The house burned down circa 1848 to 55, and there were some unsavory local stories as to what took place there. My guess is that your farmhouse had been built over or incorporated a similar megalithic site, and that your sticks indicate some unknown cult still survived there. I can recall certain vague references to lattice devices figuring in secret ceremonies, but can pinpoint nothing definite. Possibly they represent a development of occult symbols to be used in certain conjurations, but this is just a guess. I suggest you consult Waite's Ceremonial Magic, or such, to see if you can recognize similar magical symbols. Hope this is of some use to you. Please let me hear back. Sincerely, Alexander Steffroy. There was a postcard enclosed, a photograph of a 4.5-ton granite slab, ringed by a deep groove with a spout, identified as the sacrificial table at Mystery Hill. On the back, Steffroy had written, "You must have found something similar to this. They are not rare. We have one in Pelham, removed from a site now beneath Cobham Reservoir. They were used for sacrifice, animal and human, and the groove is to channel blood into a bowl, presumably." Leverett dropped the card and shuddered. Steffroy's letter reawakened the old horror, and he wished now he had let the matter lie, forgotten in his files. Of course, it couldn't be forgotten, even after 30 years. He wrote Steffroy a careful letter, thanking him for his information and adding a few minor details to his account. This spring, he promised, wondering if he would keep that promise, he would try to relocate the farmhouse on Man Brook. 5. Spring was late that year, and it was not until early June that Colin Leverett found time to return to Man Brook. On the surface, very little had changed in 3 decades. The ancient stone bridge yet stood, nor had the country lane been paved. Leverett wondered whether anyone had driven past since his terror-sped flight. He found the old railroad grade easily as he started downstream. 30 years, he told himself, but the chill inside him only tightened. The going was far more difficult than before. The day was unbearably hot and humid. Wading through the rank underbrush raised clouds of black flies that savagely bit him. Evidently, the stream had seen severe flooding in the past years, judging from piled logs and debris that blocked his path. Stretches were scooped out to barren rocks and gravel. Elsewhere, gigantic barriers of uprooted trees and debris looked like ancient and moldering fortifications. As he worked his way down the valley, he realized that his search would yield nothing. So intense had been the force of the long-ago flood that even the course of the stream had changed. Many of the dry wall culverts no longer spanned the brook, but sat lost and alone, far back from its present banks. Others had been knocked flat and swept away, or were buried beneath tons of rotting logs. At one point Leverett found remnants of an apple orchard, groping through weeds and brushes. He thought that the house must be close by, but here the flooding had been particularly severe, and evidently even these ponderous stone foundations had been toppled over and buried beneath debris. Leverett finally turned back to his car. His step was lighter. A few weeks later, he received a response from Steffroy to his reported failure. "Forgive my tardy reply to your letter of 13th June. I have recently been pursuing inquiries which may, I hope, lead to the discovery of a previously unreported megalithic site of major significance. Naturally, I am disappointed that no traces remained of the Man Brook site. While I tried not to get my hopes up, it did seem likely that the foundations would have survived. In searching through regional data, I note that there were particularly severe flash floods in the Otsilik area in July 1942, and again in May 1946. Very probably, your old farmhouse, with its enigmatic devices, was utterly destroyed not very long after your discovery of the site. This is weird and wild country, and doubtless there is much we shall never know. I write this with a profound sense of personal loss over the death 2 nights ago of Prescott Brandon. This was a severe blow to me, as I am sure it was to you and to all who knew him. I only hope the police will catch the vicious killers who did this senseless act. Evidently thieves were surprised while ransacking his office. Police believe the killers were high on drugs from the mindless brutality of their crime. I had just received a copy of the third Allard volume, Unhallowed Places, a superbly designed book, and this tragedy becomes all the more insuperable with the realization that Scotty will give the world no more such treasures. In sorrow, Alexander Steffroy. Leverett stared at the letter in shock. He had not received news of Brandon's death, had only a few days before opened a parcel from the publisher containing a first copy of Unhallowed Places. A line in Brandon's last letter recurred to him, a line that seemed amusing to him at the time. Your sticks have bewildered a good many fans, Colin, and I have worn out a ribbon answering inquiries. One fellow in particular, a Major George Leonard, has pressed me for details, and I'm afraid that I told him too much. He has written several times for your address, but knowing how you value your privacy, I told him simply to permit me to forward any correspondence. He wants to see your original sketches, I gather, but these overbearing occult types give me a pain. Frankly, I wouldn't care to meet the man myself. 6. Mr. Colin Leverett. Leverett studied the tall, lean man who stood smiling at the doorway of his studio. The sports car he had driven up in was black and looked expensive. The same held for the turtleneck and leather slacks he wore, and the sleek briefcase he carried. The blackness made his thin face deathly pale. Leverett guessed his age to be late 40 by the thinning of his hair. Dark glasses hid his eyes, black driving gloves his hands. Scotty Brandon told me where to find you, the stranger said. Scotty? Leverett's voice was wary. Yes, we lost a mutual friend, I regret to say. I'd been talking with him just before, but I see by your expression that Scotty never had time to write. He fumbled awkwardly. I am Dana Allard. Allard? His visitor seemed embarrassed. Yes, H. Kenneth Allard was my uncle. I hadn't realized Allard left a family, mused Leverett, shaking the extended hand. He had never met the writer personally, but there was a strong resemblance to the few photographs he had seen, and Scotty had been paying royalty checks to an estate of some sort, he recalled. My father was Kent's half-brother. He later took his father's name, but there was no marriage, if you follow. Of course. Leverett was abashed. Please find a place to sit down. And what brings you here? Dana Allard tapped his briefcase. Something I'd been discussing with Scotty. Just recently I turned up a stack of my uncle's unpublished manuscripts. He unlatched the briefcase and handed Leverett a sheaf of yellowed paper. Father collected Kent's personal effects from the state hospital as next of kin. He never thought much of my uncle, or his writing. He stuffed this away in our attic and forgot about it. Scotty was quite excited when I told him of my discovery. Leverett was glancing through the manuscript, page on page of cramped handwriting, with revisions pieced throughout like an indecipherable puzzle. He had seen photographs of Allard's manuscripts. There was no mistaking this. Or the prose. Leverett read a few passages with rapt absorption. It was authentic and brilliant. Uncle's mind seemed to have taken on an especially morbid turn as his illness drew on, Dana hazarded. I admire his work very greatly, but I find these last few pieces, well, a bit too horrible, especially his translation of his mythical Book of Elders. It appealed to Leverett perfectly. He barely noticed his guest as he pored over the brittle pages. Allard was describing a megalithic structure his doomed narrator had encountered in the crypts beneath an ancient churchyard. There were references to elder glyphics that resembled his lattice devices. Look here, pointed Dana. These incantations he records here from Alori Zrokros's forbidden tome, Yokth Yukth Sut Hyrath Yognath. Hell, I can't pronounce them, and he has pages of them. This is incredible, Leverett protested. He tried to mouth the alien syllables. It could be done. He even detected a rhythm. Well, I'm relieved that you approve. I'd feared these last few stories and fragments might prove too much for Kent's fans. Then you're going to have them published? Dana nodded. Scotty was going to. I just hoped those thieves weren't searching for this. A collector would pay a fortune. but Scotty said he was going to keep this secret until he was ready for announcement. His thin face was sad. So now I'm going to publish it myself, in a deluxe edition, and I want you to illustrate it. I'd feel honored, vowed Leverett, unable to believe it. I really liked those drawings you did for the trilogy. I'd like to see more like those, as many as you feel like doing. I mean to spare no expense in publishing this. And those stick things. Yes? Scotty told me the story on those. Fascinating. And you have a whole notebook of them? May I see it? Leverett hurriedly dug the notebook from his file, returned to the manuscript. Dana paged through the book in awe. These things are totally bizarre, and there are references to such things in the manuscript to make it even more fantastic. Can you reproduce them all for the book? All I can remember, Leverett assured him, and I have a good memory. But won't that be overdoing it? Not at all. They fit into the book, and they're utterly unique. No, put everything you've got into this book. I'm going to entitle it Dwellers in the Earth, after the longest piece. I've already arranged for its printing, so we can begin as soon as you have the art ready, and I know you'll give it your all. 7. He was floating in space. Objects drifted past him. Stars, he first thought. The objects drifted closer. Sticks. Stick lattices of all configurations. And then he was drifting among them, and he saw that they were not sticks, not of wood. The lattice designs were of dead pale substance, like streaks of frozen starlight. They reminded him of glyphics of some unearthly alphabet, complex, enigmatic symbols arranged to spell what? And there was an arrangement, a three-dimensional pattern, a maze of utterly baffling intricacy. Then somehow he was in a tunnel, a cramped, stone-lined tunnel, through which he must crawl on his belly. The dank, moss-slimed stones pressed close about his wriggling form, evoking shrill whispers of claustrophobic dread. And after an indefinite space of crawling through this and other stone-lined burrows, and sometimes through passages whose angles hurt his eyes, he would creep forth into a subterranean chamber. Great slabs of granite, a dozen feet across, formed the walls and ceiling of this buried chamber, and between the slabs other burrows pierced the earth. Altar-like, a gigantic slab of gneiss waited in the center of the chamber. A spring welled darkly between the stone pillars that supported the table. Its outer edge was encircled by a groove, sickeningly stained by the substance that clotted in the stone bowl beneath its collecting spout. Others were emerging from the darkened burrows that ringed the chamber, slouched figures only dimly glimpsed and vaguely human. And a figure in a tattered cloak came toward him from the shadow, stretched out a claw-like hand to seize his wrist and draw him toward the sacrificial table. He followed unresistingly, knowing that something was expected of him. They reached the altar, and in the glow from the cuneiform lattices chiseled into the gneiss slab he could see the guide's face. A mouldering corpse face, the rotted bone of its forehead smashed inward upon the foulness that oozed forth. And Leverett would awaken to the echo of his screams. He'd been working too hard, he told himself, stumbling about in the darkness, getting dressed because he was too shaken to return to sleep. The nightmares had been coming every night. No wonder he was exhausted. But in his studio his work awaited him. Almost 50 drawings finished now, and he planned another score. No wonder the nightmares. It was a grueling pace, but Dana Allard was ecstatic with the work he had done, and Dwellers in the Earth was waiting. Despite problems with typesetting, with getting the special paper Dana wanted, the book only waited on him. Though his bones ached with fatigue, Leverett determinedly trudged through the graying night. Certain features of the nightmare would be interesting to portray. 8. The last of the drawings had gone off to Dana Allard in Petersham, and Leverett, 15 pounds lighter and gut-weary, converted part of the bonus check into a case of good whiskey. Dana had the offset presses rolling as soon as the plates were shot from the drawings. Despite his precise planning, presses had broken down. One printer quit for reasons not stated, There had been a bad accident at the new printer. Seemingly innumerable problems, and Dana had been furious at each delay. But the production pushed along quickly for all that. Leverett wrote that the book was cursed, but Dana responded that a week would see it ready. Leverett amused himself in his studio, constructing stick lattices and trying to catch up on his sleep. He was expecting a copy of the book when he received a letter from Steffroy. Have tried to reach you by phone the last few days, but no answer at your house. I am pushed for time now, so must be brief. I have indeed uncovered an unsuspected megalithic site of enormous importance. It's located on the estate of a long prominent Massachusetts family, and as I cannot receive authorization to visit it, I will not say where. Have investigated secretly, and quite illegally, for a short time one night, and was nearly caught. Came across reference to the place in collection of 17th century letters and papers in a divinity school library. Writer denouncing the family as a brood of sorcerers and witches, references to alchemical activities and other less savory rumors, and describes underground stone chambers, megalithic artifacts, etc., which are put to foul usage and diabolic practice. Just got a quick glimpse, but his description was not exaggerated. And Colin, in creeping through the woods to get to the site, I came across dozens of your mysterious sticks. Brought a small one back, and have it here to show you. Recently constructed, and exactly like your drawings. With luck, I'll gain admittance, and find out their significance. Undoubtedly they have significance, though these cultists can be stubborn about sharing their secrets. Will explain my interest is scientific, no exposure to ridicule, and see what they say. We'll get a closer look one way or another. And so, I'm off. Sincerely, Alexander Steffroy. Leverett's bushy brows rose. Allard had intimated certain dark rituals in which the stick lattices figured. But Allard had written over 30 years ago, and Leverett assumed the writer had stumbled onto something similar to the Man Brook site. Steffroy was writing about something current. He rather hoped Steffroy would discover nothing more than an inane hoax. The nightmares haunted him still, familiar now, for all that scenes and phantasms were visited by him only in dream. Familiar. The terror that they evoked was undiminished. Now he was walking through forest, a section of hills that seemed to be close by. A huge slab of granite had been dragged aside, and a pit yawned where it had lain. He entered the pit without hesitation, and the rounded steps that led downward were known to his tread. A buried stone chamber, and leading from it, stone-lined burrows. He knew which one to crawl into. And again the underground room, with its sacrificial altar, and its dark spring beneath, and the gathering circle of poorly glimpsed figures. A knot of them clustered about the stone table, and as he stepped toward them, he saw they pinned a frantically wreathing man. It was a stoutly built man, white hair disheveled, flesh gouged and filthy. Recognition seemed to burst over the contorted features, and he wondered if he should know the man. But now the lich, with the caved-in skull, was whispering in his ear, and he tried not to think of the unclean things that peered from that cloven brow, and instead took the bronze knife from the skeletal hand, and raised the knife high, and because he could not scream and awaken, did with the knife as the tattered priest had whispered. And when after an interval of unholy madness he at last did awaken, the stickiness that covered him was not cold sweat, nor was it nightmare, the half-devoured heart he clutched in one fist. 9. Leverett somehow found sanity enough to dispose of the shredded lump of flesh. He stood under the shower all morning, scrubbing his skin raw. He wished he could vomit. There was a news item on the radio. The crushed body of noted archaeologist Dr. Alexander Steffroy had been discovered beneath a fallen granite slab near Wakely. Police speculated the gigantic slab had shifted with the scientists' excavations at its base. Identification was made through personal effects. When his hands stopped shaking enough to drive, Leverett fled to Petersham, reaching Dana Allard's old stone house about dark. Allard was slow to answer his frantic knock. "Why, good evening, Colin. What a coincidence you're coming here just now. The books are ready. The bindery just delivered them." Leverett brushed past him. "We've got to destroy them," he blurted. He'd thought a lot since morning. Destroy them? There's something none of us figured on. Those stick lattices. There's a cult. Some damnable cult. The lattices have some significance in their rituals. Steffroy hinted once they might be glyphics of some sort, I don't know. But the cult is still alive. They killed Scotty. They killed Steffroy. They're on to me. I don't know what they intend. They'll kill you to stop you from releasing this book. Dana's frown was worried, but Leverett knew he hadn't impressed him the right way. "Colin, this sounds insane. You really have been overextending yourself, you know. Look, I'll show you the books. They're in the cellar." Leverett let his host lead him downstairs. The cellar was quite large, flagstoned and dry. A mountain of brown, wrapped bundles awaited them. "Put them down here where they wouldn't knock the floor out," Dana explained. "They start going out to distributors tomorrow. Here, I'll sign your copy." Distractedly, Leverett opened a copy of Dwellers in the Earth. He gazed at his lovingly rendered drawings of rotting creatures, and buried stone chambers, and stained altars, and everywhere the enigmatic latticework structures. He shuddered. "Here." Dana Allard handed Leverett the book he had signed. "And to answer your question, they are Elder graphics." But Leverett was staring at the inscription in its unmistakable handwriting. "For Colin Leverett, without whom this work would not have seen completion. H. Kenneth Allard." Allard was speaking. Leverett saw places where the hastily applied, flesh-toned makeup didn't quite conceal what lay beneath. Glyphics symbolic of alien dimensions, inexplicable to the human mind, but essential fragments of an evocation so unthinkably vast that the pentagram, if you will, is miles across. Once before we tried, but your iron weapon destroyed part of Althal's brain. He erred at the last instant, almost annihilating us all. Althal had been formulating the evocation since he fled the advance of iron 4 millennia past. Then you reappeared, Colin Everett, you with your artist's knowledge and diagrams of Althal's symbols. And now 1,000 new minds will read the evocation you have returned to us. Unite with our minds as we stand in the hidden places. And the great old ones will come forth from the earth, and we, the dead who have steadfastly served them, shall be masters of the living. Leverett turned to run, but now they were creeping forth from the shadows of the cellar, as massive flagstones slid back to reveal the tunnels beyond. He began to scream as Althal came to lead him away, but he could not awaken, could only follow. Some pulpy goodness. In 1976, and very heavily into the Cthulhu mythos. I didn't remember it as referencing Mystery Hill like so explicitly.
Yeah,
yeah.
I noticed that.
Yeah.
I thought, he's right.
Yeah. Because, it's creepy.
Apparently. The turn at the end was so quick. It was like so fast. Just boom.
This genre fiction is Pulp Fiction. It's horror fiction, yeah. Yeah, there's a good essay by, what's her name? She writes everything. Joyce Carol Oates. About genre. Because she writes in every genre. Plus, literature. And, or literary fiction, as it's called. And has written successfully in every genre. I mean, romance, horror, mystery, just name it. And, she's written a couple books in it. And, they even made a joke about her in Mystery Science Theater. About her prodigious output. But, 30 years ago, yeah.
Would you call it prodigious?
Yeah, abundant, large.
Prolific.
Prolific is usually used, but prodigious means abundant.
Oh.
Anyway, she writes a lot, and she had an essay, it was in some anthology I'd read about distinguishing genre fiction from, or what distinguishes genre fiction from literary fiction. And but the key thing she writes about how in genre fiction you have a manipulation of the reader. It's like a device that is to force a reaction in the reader. trying to evoke this particular emotion. And she writes, because of that, like, you get these formulas. Stories follow a well-worn progression, but literary fiction does not necessarily have that. But literary fiction can be trying to do one or multiple of a myriad of different things. But Keeley, it's not necessary to have a manipulation. It can have a manipulation.
Keeley.
But it doesn't necessarily have it. And she would be the one to know. It's a good essay.
Thank you.
That Keeley, I don't think that's the word it's used. I've used it before.
I remember when you used it and you said, I think I said Keeley.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, it's...
I wouldn't have
I
noticed.
guess you could say importantly instead, but...
I like Keeley, actually. Because at first, I didn't know what it was, so...
Yeah.
Just for a second. It's like, oh, Keeley.
Yeah,
Yeah, it makes sense.
I don't know if anyone else has ever used that word.
Ever.
Yeah.
I'm guessing someone somewhere has. It's hard to imagine no one ever adding an ly to key to make it into an adverb.
Yeah,
Adverb.
yeah. I'm sure it's not in a dictionary, so therefore it's not a word. Why?
Because you're making fun of me.
You?
Yeah. I was thinking about